Rangers lead the way. This is the motto we won on the bloody Omaha beach, and this phrase best describes us. Before entering Ranger School, I served with the Rakasana. But when I left there, I was offered a post in the 75th Ranger Regiment, which technically traces its origins to Rogers Rangers, famous during the French and Indian War. I then spent intensive time in Paksha province working with local people on both sides of the Afghan border. The Pashtuns are a cruel and merciless people, which may explain why Afghanistan has become a barrier to every Western nation from the Macedonians, the British, the Russians to us. Most guys stay in the service for the full 20 years they receive their Ranger badge. But my opinion changed due to one incident. It was a moonless night, and we were on duty at a checkpoint on the Kabul-Gardez road. Rangers are not used for normal tasks, but intelligence received information about an impending terrorist attack at the University of Gardez, and our squad was the only available force. The darkness in the valleys of the Hindu Kush is absolute, and you may have the feeling that you are the last people on earth, sitting on a deserted stretch of road in this ancient and merciless land. Around midnight, we heard something big approaching us, so we turned on our tactical lights to warn them to stop. What we illuminated was a large cement truck, and it was coming towards us at high speed. We turned on our tactical lights again, but he didn't slow down. At this moment, the car was no more than 100 yards away from us. Everyone knew the mixer could be filled with enough Semtex or C4 to blow us all up, and it didn't stop. So the commander ordered us to open fire. I emptied the 30-round magazine of my saw, and I think I was the one who showed the most restraint. The threat from the approaching truck was so terrifying. The truck eventually stopped. The first daredevil who examined it found no explosives, only cement. The problem was that there was one old man there. We couldn't ask him why he didn't stop, because he was dead. We suffered no consequences. We did everything according to the rules, but I still couldn't get rid of his image. So I resigned at the end of my service. I've had my fill of killing. Now I want to help people. I decided that the best way to achieve this goal was something in the medical field. I knew that at the age of 31, I was too old to go down the traditional medical school route. Moreover, I had no academic background, but the paramedic program seemed like something I could handle. I was nervous when I went to the interview. I had an advantage in admission due to my veteran status, but I had an online bachelor's degree. It was biology, not nursing or anything medical. However, 6 years as a combat medic made me incredibly qualified in their eyes. When you are in a ranger unit, you are an infantryman until you are told otherwise, so I was never covered by Article 25. But I did 18 weeks of medical training at Fort Sam Houston, and that moss was what I did in our unit. So that fall I started taking classes at the Iowa School of Medicine and Public Health, right between the two lakes off de La Plaine Court. This was my first acquaintance with a medical institution. Medicine has its hoops of fire, as does the military, and I quickly found my place in the grand scheme of things. Members of the medical faculty were at the top of the food chain. They usually walked to work right on the water of Lake Mendota. Then there were the medical students. Strangely, their shit doesn't stink. Hospital and public health administrators believed that all doctors were incompetent, especially when it came to the heart of good health care, the paperwork. Then there were nurses and paramedic students. We were too numerous and insignificant for the great and the good to notice us. The student body itself was a revelation, especially for a guy with my background. I joined the Army at 18 and spent almost half my life under strict military discipline, so it was difficult for my peers to understand me. This was mainly because they were younger than me and had never experienced what I had to deal with. You grow up quickly in the Army. From the first day of boot camp, personal responsibility is instilled in you, and nothing teaches you more about your mortality than daily patrols in places like Kandahar or Gardez. My classmates had never experienced this, so they all seemed young to me, especially with the constant girl hunting and partying. Paramedics practice primary health care, diagnosis and treatment in remote locations. Of course, this happens under the watchful eye of a real doctor, as many doctors like to point out. So I did my postgraduate residency in family medicine at a small practice southeast of Eau Claire. The place was far from Chicago or even Eau Claire. It was a small town of 500 residents near the Wisconsin Dells. It was beautiful in the spirit of a place that time had forgotten, gentle and peaceful, and it began to banish the nightmares. I saw too much death in my past life and began to understand where I belonged. Small towns in Wisconsin are in the middle of nowhere, so from a family medicine perspective, I was the only doctor in town. I already had a license. I passed pants when I graduated and could write prescriptions, but I still had to be under the supervision of a licensed physician. My supervising physician was a local family doctor. Dr. Ball Morton more or less left the patient care to me. He appeared from time to demonstrate his presence. He had lived in the country all his life, except for his time in Iowa Medical School, and looked and acted like something out of a 1930s dust storm movie. He was a kind old man who served his community faithfully for over 50 years. I think he saw me as a son because he was always kind and helpful to me. The clinic itself was located in a building on the main street. It was small. Essentially, it was me, a nurse, and a receptionist. Nurses traveled from Madison to perform clinical assignments. Mostly these were people 22, 23 years old, just finishing their studies. The city was not a place of entertainment, so my nurses gravitated to Eau Claire for fun. The fact that girls went to Eau Claire for the nightlife should give you an idea of how interesting and vibrant our city was. I was almost 34 years old at the time, and my only goal was to settle down. The problem was that I had no one to settle down with, despite the efforts of the locals. I was their version of the town doctor, and there were many single women who made their interest clear. Even so, I've been with all sorts of women in my Army career, from debutantes at Fort Bragg to brothels in Kabul. So the women in this place could not interest such a sophisticated person as me. But that changed one spring morning. Wisconsin is a scary place in the winter. The snow is knee-deep, the colors are only black and white, and the air is so cold it freezes the hairs of your nose. But then the weather changes, the sun comes out, it gets warm, green leaves appear, and May arrives. I was informed that O Family Medicine was sending a new nurse intern who actually requested this assignment. This was striking in itself, since most of the nurses felt that they were being punished. I called the doctor, and we waited behind the counter to interview the new girl. While we were waiting, the door opened and a woman entered. She was absolutely stunning. Swedish blonde, with long, thick, almost white hair framing a perfect oval face. She looked like a sports magazine cover model, approximately 5 or 6 tall, slender, and clearly in good physical shape, with long, beautiful, well-toned legs in a modest business-length skirt. She was probably about 29 years old. I should have rejoiced at her unexpected appearance. However, I was actually a little annoyed. This was a woman any man would want to get to know better, but instead I had to interview a painfully sincere nursing student. This illustrated the moment I have been experiencing lately. When I saw a woman I liked, I was either busy doing something else, or she was walking down the street with her husband and children. I said sharply, "Sit down, miss. We'll get to you as soon as we can." She said, "Dr. Morton?" The doctor replied, "Yes." She looked a little puzzled and asked me, "Who are you?" I answered sharply, perhaps too rudely, "I'm his paramedic. How can I help?" She also responded sharply, "My name is Eva Pedersen, and I was scheduled to interview with Dr. Morton for a position as a clinical nurse trainee." Damn it. This amazing woman was who we were waiting for. Naturally, I began to make excuses. I said, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice, "I'm sorry, Miss Pedersen. We were expecting someone much younger." My God, am I such an idiot? She smiled at my embarrassment. She knew the impression she made on men. She said, "I earned my bachelor's degree on a Navy ROTC scholarship, so I served 4 years of active duty with the Marines." She added, "I was in the reserves while I was doing my master's in Chicago, and it took me a while." Great! She was a military nurse, an officer, and probably more qualified than me. The doctor intervened at this point. He sat watching me writhe in the wind, an expression of indulgent amusement on his face. He said, "We were expecting a fourth-year student, Eva, not someone with your qualifications. What would make you apply for such a position?" She turned her dazzling gaze on my kind old friend and said, "I was born and raised on Buckman Street, Doctor. You do not remember me? I was a skinny little girl back then. But my mom still owns the Hot Spot Cafe." The doctor looked stunned and said, "Are you Doris's girl?" She smiled even wider and said, "In the flesh." It was quite an impressive body. She walked around the corner and hugged the old man, studiously avoiding me. "Okay, I really was a complete idiot." She said, "I've been to different places with the Marines. Some of them were pretty terrible. I had a wonderful childhood, and now I want to return home forever." It would take me too long to list all the thoughts that were running through my head. A beautiful, well-educated, and worldly woman wants to work in a place where I am starting to put down roots. She had about as much military experience as me, some of which was obviously in the service. She has excellent medical qualifications. Moreover, there was no way we could avoid being near each other for a significant part of each day. The interview was short, mostly a background check. We would take anyone sent from Madison, but it's polite to at least look like you're choosing. The entire time she spoke, Eva sat carefully, knees together, and spoke in the disciplined voice of a Navy lieutenant. Of course, her voice was low, soft, and incredibly sensual. I had a thought, but I knew I couldn't express it without getting into trouble with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Is she married? I realized that my immediate interest in her marital status made me seem preoccupied. But Eva Pedersen was so attractive. I knew I could ask her about her work history, which might give me a clue about her marital status. I learned that she served in Balad in Iraq and twice in Craig, Bagram, which was while I was in the South. So she understood. It didn't take more than 10 seconds to decide that she was right for us, since she was probably better qualified to work in Chicago than here. The doctor said, "Where do you plan to live, Eva?" She perked up and said, "With Mom. She has too much space since Dad died." The doctor said, "Yes, I remember. It was last year, wasn't it? We were all very upset. He was a good man." Then he added, casually, "So what could bring you back here? Is this a pretty slow place for a woman with your background?" He didn't add, "and your beauty." However, I thought about it. She looked sad and said, "I married an absolutely terrible man right after I got out of the Navy. I don't know why I did it, except that he was pursuing me so persistently. I should have been stronger, but he was so persistent, and I finally gave in." She looked embarrassed, adding, I really tried. But one terrible night in Barcelona, I finally realized that he didn't love me. I was simply his property. How I found out is too personal to describe, but it gave me the courage to divorce him." She cried, saying, "After the divorce, I was empty and apathetic, just drifting. Then I came back here for my dad's funeral, and I felt like I had found my place. This simple place was where my life was happiest, and this is where I want to be now forever. So I'm looking forward to a new beginning, and this time I'm not going anywhere." Of course, my selfish personal response was, "She's free." Thus began our life together, providing family medicine to the residents of Eau Claire County. I was at the top of the chain of command as Dr. B.C. Morton more or less handed over all aspects of the case to me. He was still kind and supportive, but he was already over 70. It was truly idyllic. We did routine primary care, basic diagnosis and treatment, and referred to Madison if we encountered something we couldn't handle or something serious. Eva took care of patients and, in most cases, women in the area. I dealt with everything else: children, families, and the occasional patient. My life has been very busy. I was a pillar of the community, loved and respected by everyone in town, and I worked side by side with a woman who was both beautiful and an excellent friend and companion. Our start could have been a lot more awkward, but by the end of the first month, we were as close as a man and a woman could be. This was mainly because there were only 2 of us in the office, and it was 8 to 10 hours a day. But also thanks to the influence of Eva's mother, Doris. I knew Doris from her diner. She was one of those individuals that can only be found in a small town. I lived almost next door to her diner, so I went there every morning for breakfast. It kept me connected to the community and also helped me keep my finger on the pulse of the city. The diner was the center of all the events in the area, so if you wanted to know what was going on, you had to go to Doris. Her diner had been the center of town life for at least 30 years. She knew everyone, and everyone knew her. She clearly loved her daughter and seemed to treat me like an adopted son. I lived in a small bungalow. It was a bachelor life, just me and my dog Buster. I adopted Buster from a shelter in Madison. He's big and ugly, but unconditionally loyal and loving. A person still suffering from hyperattention and other symptoms of PTSD needs the calming power of a dog. So Buster always sat next to the front desk to show me who loved me. A large, slobbery dog has no place in a medical office. But no one gave Buster up, and in many ways he was as famous in the area as I was. Anyone who served in the Rangers knows how to stand up for themselves. But Eva's mother Doris believed that I would starve to death alone. So every Sunday Buster and I were invited to the Pedersen house for the same feast that I remembered from my childhood in a German family. The Pedersen home was a classic two-story stone colonial that can be seen throughout Wisconsin. It was big and substantial, light and airy, and it smelled like Thanksgiving every time I came to visit. Buster and I never missed a Sunday, both for the same reason: food. Doris owned a diner, so she was a great cook. But Eva was a first-class clinician, not a cook, so the question was, why was Eve such a good cook? In fact, Eve could cook a meal that could feed an entire infantry brigade, and her cooking skills may have been slightly better than her mother's. I was sitting in their living room one Sunday evening after Eva fed me something that tasted like it came from the kitchen of Louis Roman XIV. Eva cooked because Doris had to work the evening shift at the diner, so we were completely alone. Buster clung to my leg as all big dogs do to show affection. Eva bustled around in a cute Brady's Mom-themed apron that felt like something out of the 1950s. It was an absurd sight, as it was the exact opposite of who Eve was and what she looked like in her usual medical scrubs. She came and sat in the chair opposite and said, "Can I ask you a personal question?" I laughed and said, "After this meal, you can ask me for my whole biography, including all the dirty secrets." She said, "Do you like men?" I said that. She said, "I was thinking about why you never tried to hit on me. Is it because you play for another team? I'm just curious to know." She was serious. I said, "I never tried to hit on you because you are my colleague. We work together." She said, "So what? Every man I've ever worked with was trying to do something." This made me unreasonably jealous, but I restrained myself and said calmly, "It's not that I don't find you attractive. You are stunning, but I want to work with you for the rest of my career, at least if it's up to me, and I wouldn't want to ruin it for a quick fling." I added, "I respect you endlessly. You are an excellent nurse, and I feel it is disrespectful to try to hit on you while we are also caring for the good people of this county." She said, "Okay, I understand, but now we are alone here on Sunday. If you do this now, it will be a sign that you find me attractive, that you really want me." Then she hesitated and said in a whisper, "As much as I want you." And finally, everything was open. I think it was inevitable. We were two healthy young men. We've been working together as closely as possible for almost a year now. During this time, I never missed an opportunity to admire her firm, round butt, her sweet, firm hips, her thin waist, and her beautiful small breasts. I think she did the same to me. We worked as a well-coordinated team and anticipated each other's thoughts, so much so that it was like an old married couple. The people of Eau Claire County depended on us, and the feeling of satisfaction and recognition kept us in a contented sense of fellowship, which was, indeed, fertile soil for the seeds of love to grow. The beautiful woman I had both admired and desired had just offered herself to me, and I knew I would not disappoint the poor girl. I looked at her as openly as possible and said, "If we get intimate, I want it to be a real relationship, not just sex. We still have to work together, and sex always changes the team dynamic. so I'm not interested in it if it's a one-time thing just for a little fun after dinner tonight. I looked at her intently, hoping to convey my sincerity, and said, "You are too special to me for a casual fling, so you'll have to tell me that you want something deeper and more personal. If you can't do it, I want to leave tonight and for both of us to forget you ever mentioned it." She looked at me as if I had finally discovered something that everyone else had known for a long time. She simply said, "I love you, Jonathan. I've loved you for a long time. I want everything you can give me, and I want this forever. Is this clear enough for you?" I remember thinking as we walked together into her large but cozy bedroom, things this perfect don't happen to me. We were married 4 months later in a beautiful fall ceremony at the Lutheran church in town. Lutherans are as numerous in small towns in Wisconsin as Catholics are in the Vatican. It was a public event that attracted hundreds of well-wishers, most of whom were our patients. Doris organized the reception. It was a dinner to rival the feasts that Julius Caesar threw for the Roman masses. God forgive me, but I must admit that I loved Doris much more than my own mother. In fact, Doris and Dr. Bowes Morton were more to me than my biological parents. The doctor and I had the kind of relationship that a young man has with an older role model, and Doris made us feel especially secure, confident, and loved. Doris was a tough old Swede who lived life to the fullest, never backing down from a challenge, and always supporting the people she loved. Watching Doris' life explained a lot about my wife's indomitable spirit. Doris simply had an extra dose of accumulated wisdom, which only made her more attractive. She was nearly 70 at the time, but she was still energetic and personally inspiring, as she must have been when Eva was growing up. Doris's first action as my mother-in-law was to switch houses. She had a large 2-story stone colonial home that she and her husband bought in the 1970s. It looked like something out of a classic Andy Hardy movie and was a beautiful place to raise children. My little bungalow was very cozy and comfortable, and it was almost next door to Doris's diner, so it was both convenient and much easier to maintain for a woman who worked 10 hours a day. Doris could probably retire, but she seemed to feed off the energy of her establishment. 7 years of absolutely satisfactory life have passed. Eva was a wonderful friend, helper, and lover. Some couples love to communicate. We did this a bit, but mostly we just spent time together, working at the clinic and enjoying life as a married couple, completely satisfied with each other. Our clinic was practically the only one in an area of 600 square miles, so we could not take an extended vacation. But we spent a lot of time outdoors, kayaking and exploring the vast expanses of nature that surrounded us. Besides being the hottest woman, Eva was very smart with a great sense of humor and exceptional nursing skills. She was so well-read that I didn't feel like we were stuck in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. We've both seen too much evil and cruelty, so for us, the peace and quiet of our lives was completely restorative and invigorating. However, there was one dark cloud. Almost from the very beginning of our marriage, we tried to have children, but we were both medical specialists. We knew there had to be some problem with her reproductive system, so we finally drove to Rochester, 2.5 hours from Mississippi. The Mayo people were very sympathetic, but it turned out that Eva had some kind of chronic illness, which probably prevented her from carrying the child to term. Of course, there were surgical solutions, but they were invasive and would make it difficult to conceive. The fact that Eva was also 36 years old at the time further increased the odds against her. So in the end, we just accepted the fact that we weren't having kids. It was a sad time. We both wanted children. However, fate chose to take away one of life's special experiences from us. Eva was especially depressed. I kept telling her it didn't matter, but it hit her feminine ego, and I could see that it threw her off balance emotionally. Basically, she became much more needy and less confident in our relationship. In the past, she was happy to make fun of me for any reason. Now she sometimes kept it to herself. It also affected her sense of humor, which was, in some ways, even more disturbing. I was dedicated to giving her the support she needed and knew she could do it. Then Dr. Morton died. He was in his 80s, so it wasn't unexpected. But he was a father to me, and his death knocked the support from under my entire emotional and professional life. I missed his gentle wisdom and kind-hearted guidance. I am a person who believes that I can handle any problem, and I am confident in my abilities. But like everyone else, I sometimes need support, especially after a hard day. If I ever needed encouragement, I could always count on Dr. Morton and his decades of experience. Now I had to cope with a rapidly growing practice myself. To make matters worse, I was required by law to be under the care of a licensed physician. Geographically, we were a little closer to the Mayo Clinic than Madison, and they had doctors licensed to practice in Wisconsin. So OA solved this problem by asking one of its top Mayo experts to serve as our leader. This person would come in once a week and check in daily via video to confirm that we were working under proper supervision. We met this man on the Monday after Dr. Previous Morton's funeral. I'm still in grief, and Eva wasn't in the best of shape. I sat in the same chair I had sat in when Eva walked through the door 9 years ago. We were both a little nervous, as happens when you meet a person on whom your fate depends. The door opened and a man entered. He was a couple of years younger than me, about Eva's age. I knew from his biography that he was a child prodigy with a distinguished academic and research career. But I didn't expect him to be so tall and manly. We don't usually have movie stars portraying doctors in our area. He glanced at me briefly and then turned his attention to Eve. It was an incredibly unprofessional performance. He said, "I'm Dr. Chase Williams. I would prefer it if you called me Dr. Williams or Doctor. We need to remain professional." I realized this bastard was establishing that he was superior to us. He turned to me and said, "I understand that the previous doctor gave you a very long leash. I'm not going to allow that. Therefore, I need you to record your medical activities for my review. When I am here, I expect you to confirm any final medical advice with me." I realized that he was also a control freak. I hated this freak from day one. My hatred for him grew every month. He treated me with contempt. It was personal, as if the fact that I could provide medical care was some kind of perversion of the law. I realized that I did not have his medical qualifications, but family medicine requires a lot of judgment, especially in diagnosis, and I have had decades of experience keeping my patients healthy and happy. As a result, I felt resentful of his attitude. In fact, if the locals saw how he treated me, he would be in big trouble. But this man was not only smart, but also cunning. That's why he always humiliated me when we were alone. On the other hand, he treated Eve completely differently. Dr. Dikolov showered her with praise. I saw that it helped her regain her lost confidence and self-esteem, but it was excessive. It wasn't jealousy, I'm telling you. It was just a medical fact. Eva was an excellent clinician and nurse, but she was not the second coming of Florence Nightingale, as this freak imagined her to be. I began to suspect the motives of Dr. Krenagolov. He often invaded Eve's personal space, leaning over to read the cards and placing his hand on her shoulder as he spoke. It was subtle, nothing that would warrant a sexual harassment claim, but it was clear that he was establishing dominance. For her part, Eve seemed to enjoy the attention. What woman wouldn't like that? The guy was rich, handsome, and had that divine aura that the best doctors wrap around themselves. She even flirted with him sometimes in an office-safe manner. I accepted this as a normal female reaction to a guy who clearly found her attractive, especially when I was sitting right there. I never doubted Eva's loyalty. She had been to many places and done many things and knew what she wanted. She made it clear to everyone around us that she loved me and went to great lengths to prove our physical connection. She respected me in our daily lives and was back to being as smart, energetic, and sarcastic as ever. I couldn't blame the guy for being attracted to Eve. She was almost 37 at the time and was clearly head and shoulders above all the women in the area in beauty, grace, elegance, and sophistication. When she turned 30, she changed her hairstyle from girly to feminine. Now she wore a chic bob, combed forward into two sharp wings that framed her gorgeous Swedish face. Only a woman with hair as thick as Eva's could afford such a style. She hasn't lost a bit of her attractive figure, only improved it. She was always slim. Words like flexible come to mind. But she added a little bit of what guys really love, a rounder butt and larger breasts. This made her more seductive. The doctor did not miss any of these details. I'd catch him sneaking a look at Eva's bottom as she bent over to pick up a file, and he'd give me a victorious look as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" Since he had all the legal cards in his hands, there was nothing I could do except pack my things and leave. Of course, I would never do that because by that point I was completely committed to the community. The problem was that the doctor became more and more aggressive in his interest in Eve. I didn't think he could ever drive a wedge between us personally, but constantly praising her and humiliating me, he began to tear us apart professionally. Specifically, he was clearly intent on destroying our close professional relationship. Diagnostics is always more art than science. Therefore, there inevitably comes a time when Eve's and my opinions do not coincide. We used to just discuss it for the benefit of the patient. Our only goal was to do our best. Now, if there was a disagreement, the doctor would turn it into a confrontation. Worse, he made it seem like I was being arbitrary and arrogant towards Eve and always taking her side. This was starting to have an effect. Over time, Eva began to snap at me over little things. When she did this, I talked to her about it, as always, and we eventually resolved the problem. But these increasingly frequent quarrels began to get on our nerves. Then the doctor added fuel to the fire. He was hinting that he thought I needed more training. I did 100 hours of CME to maintain my certification. But, Dr. Williams decided that I needed specialized training. Both Eva and I insisted that this was not necessary. But in his incomparably arrogant medical opinion, the doctor convinced the National Commission on Certification of Physician Assistants that I really needed a brush up. Thus, the Certification Commission in ominous tones suggested that I do what the doctor ordered. So, I was sent to a 3-week emergency medicine and trauma course in Kansas City. The journey itself turned out to be a waste of time. I was a ranger medic for almost 6 years, so he could teach instructors new things about emergency medicine and traumatology. The first week, Eva and I talked every time I had a break, morning, noon, and evening. She was bright and cheerful and recounted many funny incidents from Doris's diner. In the second week, the conversations became a little shorter, although she still told jokes, but she sounded distracted. The last week has been worrying. Eva was actually harsh when I called. She said that the workload on patients has increased, and she does not have time to talk. I knew what the workload was, so this excuse seemed strange. When I returned home, the doctor was not in Rochester, busy with his great work. The pressure was gone, and it was like old times. Eva was a crazy woman for a whole week. This happened every time we went to bed. We talked, laughed, and did all the things that make the Wisconsin Dells the perfect summer getaway. But there was something wrong with the situation. I asked Eva what the problem was, and she said it was nothing. However, I felt that something was bothering her. The doctor was incredibly arrogant when he finally decided to grace us with his presence. In fact, he was even more arrogant than usual. Eve's reaction was also strange. Before I left, their relationship was friendly and professional, perhaps even a little flirtatious. Now the doctor treated Eva the same way he always treated me, hypercritical and patronizing. I also noticed that he put his hands on it more often. This was not the kind of touching that would warrant a sexual harassment claim, but it was too overbearing for my taste. So I did what I've always done in the past. I asked her about this. We sat comfortably on the sofa and watched TV. I thought, now is the time. So I asked Eve directly, "What's going on between you and Williams?" It was a simple question asked in a neutral tone. She tensed and then said in a slightly too casual voice, "What makes you think something is going on? What are you asking about?" Well, I couldn't directly say. "I'm wondering if you're sleeping with this guy." So I said, "I don't know. It just seems like something has changed between you. Is there anything that happened while I was gone that we need to talk about?" She tensed and said casually, "Of course not." I left it at that, but Eva raised more questions than it answered. First of all, she was clearly hiding something. Moreover, I could interpret the radical change in the doctor's behavior in two ways. One possibility was that Eve did something to upset the great man. This was the simplest and most likely option. The other was much darker. I had a cold thought that maybe they were putting on an act for me. If so, then they did it very clumsily. Then the doctor dropped the bomb. He told us that the State Department had asked Mayo to lend his eminence to establish a clinic for the diagnosis and treatment of Chagas disease in Chiapas, Mexico. I would have welcomed his departure, but he ended the statement by saying he wanted Eva to go with him. I exploded. I said angrily, "Why do you want my wife to go to Mexico with you?" My voice sounded threatening, so he said disdainfully, "What's the matter? You don't want to help the poor migrant workers. I know you are too ignorant to understand the whole picture, but your wife has extensive experience working in third-world countries. In fact, she is the most qualified of all the nurses on my staff." I said angrily, "But she's not in your state." He said, "Now in mine." I added it. "You know your contract is with Mayo, right? So either she goes or we close this clinic." I couldn't let that happen. I said, "This is blackmail," and turned to Eva. I said, "Eva, you don't have to go. Just say the word and I'll leave. We can start somewhere else." We all knew I was bluffing. There was no other clinic within an hour's radius. I saw the pain she was in, and it made me even angrier. She was in the same position as me. She knew that Golden Boy was making her his personal slave, using the under surveillance clause against us. It just wasn't right. But that was the situation the medical community put us in. She very reluctantly said, "I will go. It's only been a month, and we're doing the right thing. I really have a lot of experience working in improvised conditions. More importantly, I don't want to jeopardize what we've built here, so I'll do what Dr. Williams wants." She turned to the doctor and said, "If I help you, I want your promise that you will stop controlling us and let us work as we worked before you came." The look in that bastard's eyes was pure evil. He turned to me and said in a mocking voice, "I knew you both would eventually see this through my eyes." He might as well have said, "I knew you would eventually let me sleep with your wife." I looked at Eve, and she was devastated. I always wondered why she married her first husband. This guy seemed like a golden, number one, selfish bastard, while Eva was as gentle, kind, sweet, and caring as always. The problem was that she was too nice, too polite, and would do anything to avoid confrontation, as she just did here. Of course, most healthcare professionals would have difficulty turning down the opportunity to help the less fortunate. Eva has done this 3 times already in deployments. Moreover, there was no war in Mexico. She was upset because she had to leave her husband and happy home and live in the jungle for several weeks. But the task itself was humanitarian, and I could cope with our load alone. In theory, the doctor's request was very reasonable and perhaps even laudable. However, everyone in the room knew the real reason he wanted Eve to go. This was to isolate her so he could put full pressure on her. I almost said it out loud. Unlike Eve, I have no problem with confrontation, but I knew that a fierce battle would humiliate her. No woman wants her husband to question her fidelity, and that's what I would do if I made a fuss about her being single with a doctor. So I said, "I want you to assure me that Eve will be okay." He grinned and said, "Don't worry, I'll take very good care of her." The implications of these words were almost unbearable, but in the end, I had to trust my wife, and the deal was done. She tried to kill me with love the entire weekend before she left. This behavior would not have been strange in itself, but her subsequent tears caught my attention. I asked with concern, "What happened, Eva? Why are you so upset?" She said through her tears, "I love you so much. I just can't bear to be apart from you. Do you love me?" Now this was a charged question. I said with real emotion, "Of course I love you. You are the only one I truly loved. I loved being with you and will always love you." This made her smile shyly. She said, "Sometimes I just can't deal with my feelings." She flew on a private jet provided by the State Department. The entire medical team was with her. They took off from Rochester International Airport and headed straight to Palenque International Airport with mandatory refueling. We held hands as I drove her 2.5 hours to the airport, fingers intertwined. Eva served 4 years as a combat nurse in the Marine Corps. She is strong and used to deployments. But she looked unhappy. The plane was an Army C-37B, which in its civilian version is called a Gulfstream G550. I thought, nothing, only the best for the doctor. I watched as the whole team boarded the plane. 17 people, support staff, other nurses, Eva, and the bastard himself. Eva gave me one last anguished look before she came on board. Then they drove out and disappeared into the gray clouds. It was hard to see through my tears. In the meantime, I had a clinic to run and patients to care for. Feelings of duty mean a lot to me. Eva called me later that evening. She was in a hostel they had set up outside of Palenque at the Technical University. She said she lives in a dorm room. But the university itself was an amazingly good place, incredibly modern. We talked for a long time. She was in the mood to remember all the good times. I called her again on Monday evening. She said the first day was mostly meetings. She said she was bored and missed me a lot. I understood it, since it completely coincided with my feelings in Kansas City. She said the administrative team was going to look at several sites for the clinic tomorrow. She said it would be just her, the head nurse, a doctor, a State Department representative, and 3 nurses. They had several places in mind. All of them were located in the poorest and most overpopulated part of the city. She said, "Don't worry, I'll never be alone with him." Bless her, she knew what I was thinking. I called her on Tuesday, and there was no answer. I've been trying to call all day. Her phone seemed to be off. Tuesday turned into sleepless Wednesday. I must have called 1,000,000 times. I had no idea how I was able to work that day. But doing meaningful work helps deal with a lot of anxiety. However, the weight was becoming unbearable. I decided to go to Rochester. I called the front desk and told them to reschedule the patients scheduled for tomorrow, saying that I had an urgent matter. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it and saw Doris on the threshold. I said, "Doris, good to see you, but I have to go." She stopped me and pushed me back into the house. It was so unexpected that I angrily said, "I really have to go, Doris." She looked at me seriously and said, "You will listen to me if you value your wife and my only child." I felt the walls begin to close in. I walked over to the chair, sat down to collect myself, took a deep breath and said, "Tell me everything. Don't hide anything." Doris is one of those with Viking blood in her veins, and her gaze was just as determined. She said with fury in her voice, "You probably guessed that Eve had problems with Dr. Des Williams." "So it's true." I nodded. Doris continued furiously, "He harassed her every minute you were away. She tried to avoid him. But he became more and more brazen until one day he attacked her in one of the examination rooms." I must have looked terrible because Doris hastily added, "She broke free and ran towards me. I returned to the clinic and pressed this bastard against the wall. He was very self-confident, acting as if touching nurses was his right as a doctor. I made it clear to him what the people of this city would do to him if I said one word about what he just did to Eve." I thought, this is why Eve was acting so strange. This also explains why she didn't tell me. She knew I would have killed that bastard no matter what. Then it dawned on me. It also confirmed the doctor's sudden interest in helping the people of Mexico. He wanted to isolate Eve from her support. My anxiety levels skyrocketed. Doris looked at me with a serious look and said, "That's not why I'm here." Eva listed me as her emergency contact. I looked stunned. I said, "Why you and not me?" Doris responded lovingly. "She didn't want to add unnecessary worries to you. She was leaving with Dr. Des Williams. This was bad enough. She didn't want to complicate things by implying that the area was so dangerous that she needed an emergency contact. She knew that I would tell you everything if something happened." Then she added, losing her composure, "They just called and said that the car Eve found abandoned near one of the archaeological sites. Her group was working in a bad part of town, and they were supposedly kidnapped. I knew that kidnappings were not uncommon for some elements there, Doris added sullenly. A government spokesman said they were in talks with Mexican authorities to get them back safely. I was stunned. My Eva, the love of my life, was kidnapped by a gang of Mexican criminals, and the people who put her in this situation wanted to negotiate. Every second my wife spent in the paws of these animals was a second too long. Some people might go to church to pray, but the Rangers are always ahead. Therefore, I knew what I needed to do and did not doubt it for a moment. My decision to go there and handle everything myself was not as idiotic and selfish as it might seem. Hostage rescue is part of my skill set, and this was not my first rodeo, not even my fifth. The only difference was that before we always worked as a team. This time, all the planning and execution was on me. I said, "Don't worry, Doris, I'll give her back. Just tell patients that the clinic is closed indefinitely and I will take care of the rest." The flight from O'Hare was at 5:45 a.m. He was heading to Killeen, Texas. This gave me time to make the necessary calls. You may ask why I flew to Killeen and not directly to Palenque. Well, it would take me almost 20 hours to get to Palenque by plane, taking into account all the transfers and expectations. I didn't have a luxury private jet like Dr. Krenagolov. At the same time, I could drive from Killeen to Palenque in 24 hours. Of course, that wasn't the real reason I was driving the car. I needed to stop in Killeen to pick up a few needed items. Fort Hood is the base of the 4th Infantry Division, and several of my comrades were there. So when I walked out of security into the clear Texas morning, I was greeted by two of the fraternity. They were busy while I was flying. We shook hands but wasted no time. They quickly escorted me to the Ford Explorer, which was parked with the engine running at the curb. The driver got out, we also shook hands, and I drove down the U.S. Highway 281 towards McAllen and Rio Grande. I arrived in McAllen at 1:00 p.m. The inspection at the border was superficial. I clearly wasn't suspicious. I looked military, with a distinct high and tight haircut. They quickly inspected the car and used the mirrors. Then they waved me on my way. Everything I needed was attached to the frame of the car, unrecognizable to the ordinary eye. I'll collect this when I get there. The rest looked like tourist camera equipment. Travel along the east coast of Mexico was desperately fast, so it actually took less than 20 hours. Doris kept me informed throughout the journey. The two people who were with Eva remained at the scene of the abduction to deliver the ransom demands. None of the residents of that part of the city saw anything. This was expected. The groups that commit these crimes can be very close and violent with those who saw something. Members of Eva's group said they believed it was a local gang, but they didn't know where the kidnappers were going. Eve's car was found at an archaeological site, so I decided to start from here. I arrived at the facility parking lot at 4:00 p.m. on Friday, walked 300 yards along a long road surrounded by trees to the site itself. The heat was unbearable, and the jungle around was full of movement and sounds. The noise from the monkeys and birds was like something out of a Tarzan movie. The site itself was a classic UNESCO tourist attraction, very well preserved Mayan ruins. It was at a higher elevation than the surrounding jungle, which was fortunate because I saw one of those traditional Mayan step pyramids to the right. The field of view from its top would have allowed me to see the jungle for miles around. I assumed from the very beginning that the kidnappers would go into the jungle from where they left the car, so I took the FLIR-T 20 forward-looking infrared system with me. If there was some source of heat in the surrounding jungle, I would have seen it from the top of this pyramid. I also had the third-generation Armacite N15 military night vision goggles. They would allow me to navigate in the dark. It was like noon with these glasses, and for me this comparison was appropriate. My last special equipment was a Barrett M107A1 sniper rifle with a loopholed Mark 8 M5B2 tactical scope and suppressor. Only the government has access to such equipment. My friends lent it to me for a while. I can fit 3 661-gram 50 caliber bullets into a palm-sized space from a quarter mile away, and our best snipers thought that I was a bad shot. They could do the same thing from over a mile away. Field assembly of M107 parts was strapped to the frame of the SUV. Otherwise, I would probably be suspicious if I tried to drive into Mexico with a nearly 5-meter sniper rifle in the back seat. Of course, I shouldn't have been anywhere near the archaeological site after dark, so I booked a room at the Hotel Margarita and Ed's Cabañas. I was expecting a third-rate accommodation, but what I got were cozy little individual huts among the trees of the rainforest. There were a few small lizards, but no bedbugs, and it was much nicer and more modern than I expected. More importantly, I managed to get the last house, so I wouldn't have to climb out of the bathroom window to get into the jungle. Everything had to be dark and empty before I could begin my journey. I've slept about 4 hours in the last 40 hours, and in the Rangers you learn to sleep when you can. So I set my alarm for 11:30 and slept for 4 more hours. At midnight, I was rested and walking with all my gear, heading southwest through the jungle. I aimed for the ruins. With night vision goggles, it was as bright as day, so movement was relatively easy, except for all the jungle crap, including one very large and scary snake. The archaeological site itself has been cleaned, so in order to stay hidden, I had to bypass it completely. There was no shelter as I climbed to the top of the pyramid. But once I got to the top, I could hide. I checked the immediate area with Fleur. She didn't show anything, not even the guard. So I climbed the narrow steps of the Temple of the Inscriptions and found a place at the top where I could observe. I expected that I would have to be on duty all night and possibly several more nights. But as soon as I turned on the Fleur, I saw a large hot spot on a volcanic mountain about 10 miles to the west. It glowed on Fleur like it was celebrating Cinco de Mayo. The small fire and the bodies created a lot of heat, so it was clearly a camp, although it was completely invisible to the naked eye. I thought, seriously, these guys are clearly not criminal masterminds. Of course, it was black as night, and the infrared detection might be something the Colos didn't know about. Maybe that was my goal, maybe not. At that time, I didn't know. It was 11:30 p.m., and I had about 7 hours before sunrise, so I decided to walk over there and see what I could see. In the years since I left the Rangers, I have never lost my physical fitness, so 10 miles took me a little over 2.5 hours. I had to walk up the slope. But when I got there, I found ledges and rose above my target. I wandered around until I found the perfect spot for a sniper's nest. Fleur showed a dozen heat sources. 4 of them were fuzzy, in some kind of makeshift tin house. The remaining 8 heat sources were distributed across a small clearing in front of the house. Most of them seemed to be asleep. They had a fire that created a halo that obscured part of the infrared image. I was still a quarter of a mile away, and even with the excellent resolution of my night vision goggles, it was impossible to confirm that these were the right people. It was important to confirm that these bastards were holding Eve, because if that's the case, I was going to make them all dead. I left the Fleur and Barrett at the top of the ledge and pushed the last quarter mile toward my targets. I was wearing a black, form-fitting, reflective tactical suit made of ballistic nylon with a balaclava. I was invisible in the dark unless someone was standing right next to me. I carried a Kabar and an M9 Beretta. These were my standard sidearms in the Rangers, and I was pretty confident with them. When I got to the camp, I saw that 2 of the bandits were on duty, serving as guards. They smoked and talked. I walked around the clearing, hearing one of them say something to the other. They both laughed loudly. Then the speaker got up and went into the house. There were screams. It was a disgusting sight, but it confirmed my suspicions. It was them. I just hoped I couldn't hear Eve. A couple of the gangsters, awakened by sex sounds from the lodge, got up and headed there to join the line. Meanwhile, I returned to my sniper's nest as quickly as possible. It took me a second to calm down when I got there. The thought that my wife could be used by these bandits raised my heart rate higher than necessary to fire, even at the relatively short distance of 400 yards. I took a few cleansing breaths and carefully aimed through the Barrett crosshair at the furthest sleeper from the fire. The impact of a Barrett bullet does not go unnoticed, so I planned to kill the most inconspicuous one, and then moved towards the sleeping one closer to the fire. You might ask why I didn't just go and start shooting. The answer is that I am a smart and disciplined ranger. They had AK-47s, so tactically, the odds were in favor of 8 bastards with machine guns, not one guy with 15 rounds and a short pistol. Moreover, I was Eve's last hope. If they killed me, they would bury all our bodies in a hole in the rainforest, after Eve would have been subjected to hours of indescribable horror. I wanted to be buried next to my wife, but not this way. In fact, if I was lucky, and if they were stupid enough, I could end the game right there. But first I had to tame the devil inside. I needed to convince myself that what I was doing was fair. I'm a soldier. I've killed many times, but it was always in the midst of battle. It's never easy, but it's something that can be done for the right reasons. However, it takes nerves of steel to shoot a sleeping person. There is no honor in this, no courage. It's just an execution, that's all. I told myself that I was simply removing barriers between me and my beloved, and I had no pity for my goals. It was their actions that brought death to their doorstep. I was just a performer, here to carry out the inevitable payment. Moreover, I was especially bitter towards these men because I was sure that one of them had already slept with my wife. Hell has begun. I killed the criminals, and, thank God, the woman they mocked was not Eve. I was still in my tight-fitting tactical suit with a balaclava and night vision goggles. When I entered the door of the house, 4 frightened people must have thought that they had been captured by Martians. Eva was alive. I could see them all very clearly, while they could only see a ghostly shadow. My first thought was to run over and hug Eve, but I wanted to give her a second to calm down. So I stood right next to her and said in the softest and most soothing tone I could, "It's okay, honey. The bad guys are dead." There was a pregnant pause, and Eva looked at me with surprise on her face. She said in a timid, hopeful voice, "Jonathan," I said, "Yes, my love, I'm here to take you home. I served with many brave men in my army, but my wife, my Viking shield bearer, has proven to me that she is the bravest person I have ever known. She was kidnapped, but that didn't stop her from saying, in a surprisingly calm and ironic tone, 'What took you so long?' I laughed. This is how we always made fun of each other, and given the situation, it was an incredibly brave and intimate gesture. There were 3 women and 1 man in the house. The man was a doctor. The woman who was bullied was one of the junior nurses, reduced to the state of a broken person. The other woman was also young and quite pretty. 8 Mexican thugs were apparently planning a party. I didn't regret their cruel death one bit. I cut the ropes binding Eva with the kabar and whispered, "Let's go outside." I didn't really need the whisper. The doctor made incredible noises, screamed and begged for mercy. I understood that he was afraid for his life. But this was a particularly cowardly sight. I almost walked up to him to gloat. But I knew that I had to disappear without a trace. I helped Eva up. She was in a lot of pain. Part of it was simply because she had been tied up for a long time. I didn't even want to think about other reasons. I had to lead her because she couldn't see anything. Being blindly led in pitch darkness could be scary for an ordinary person. But my wife was as brave as she was beautiful. When I brought her into the light of the fire, I took off my balaclava and night vision goggles. She put her arms around my neck, pressed herself against me, and just started sobbing. "Oh God, Jonathan, how did you find us? Where are the people who held us?" Her body shook from the onset of shock. I said with satisfaction, "They are taken out of the equation forever. Now you need to be a little more brave, or I'll be in big trouble." This quickly returned her to a more normal state. She was dirty, her golden hair was matted, and she was wearing her usual hiking shorts and boots. I said, "I just executed 8 Mexicans. Even though it was to save 4 Americans, I am a civilian, and the authorities will regard my actions as lynching, so no one should find out who did it. I'll leave you a knife and a pistol." I took out the M9 and handed it to her, hilt first. He was impersonal in advance, and Eva was good with pistols. Then I added, "You will have to get the other 3 out of here. There's a little farm road 1.5 miles to the east." I pointed to the east. My voice shook with emotion as I said, I know you can do it, my brave wife. When full dawn came, I was still in the rainforest. I passed the archaeological site, but was still about a half-mile from the resort. I might be a little suspicious if someone saw me walking down the road in black tactical gear with a sniper rifle and a backpack full of advanced combat electrical equipment. So I walked carefully, trying not to attract attention. I slipped into my hut as the villagers gathered for breakfast. 15 minutes later, I walked out to them, dressed in plaid Bermuda shorts and a bright Hawaiian shirt with a cheap Panama hat. I wanted to look like the biggest tourist in the entire state of Chiapas. I didn't want anyone to associate me with a night stalker. After breakfast, I loudly announced that I was going to look at all those antiquities on the hill. My goal was to create the impression that I knew absolutely nothing. News travels fast in Mexico, much like it does in small-town Wisconsin. Everyone at the archaeological site was discussing this when I arrived, from old ladies selling souvenirs to tour guides. Rumor has it that a farmer walking along the road to El Naranjo came across a group of emaciated and dirty Americans. They told him a fantastic story about how their captors all died at the hands of a creature with purple eyes. The locals couldn't understand how one creature could kill 8 tough guys so easily. Therefore, they were ready to believe rumors of an alien invasion. They said the leader of the group of prisoners was a determined American woman with a knife and a gun. She said she picked up the weapon from one of her dead captors. I thought, well done, Eva. The 4 prisoners were being prepared for transport to Bethesda, just as a precaution. The State Department interrogated them, but none of them saw anything other than a creature with eyes. Naturally, the authorities immediately rejected this story, but they still didn't have a better explanation. This was sensational news as the prisoners were part of a humanitarian medical team. The Mexican government denied the actions of a few criminals. The U.S. government was reviewing all of its humanitarian assistance policies. In short, it was just a simple bureaucratic mess that meant nothing. I slowly drove back to Killeen. A few extra items were attached underneath my Explorer. I handed the keys to my brothers. We shook hands, and I flew back to O'Hare. I picked up my car at the long-term storage lot and returned to treat patients at the clinic on Monday morning. It was a short and relaxing 4-day vacation. At least that was my story, and I stuck to it. Meanwhile, Doris was with Eve in Bethesda. I didn't visit her while she was there. My excuse was to manage our clinic. Both women knew the real reason. I couldn't attract attention to myself. If the press knew I was a former ranger, they might dig deeper and find 8 bodies. I couldn't allow it. Doctors in Bethesda found that Eve was in remarkably good health, both physically and mentally. I didn't find this surprising. Eva has always been a very strong woman, capable of making and implementing smart decisions in her life. Sometimes shit happens. The true measure of a person's resilience is what happens after. I knew that my Eve would not allow the actions of these 8 low-life bastards to do this to her. That didn't mean she was denying what happened. She knew perfectly well what had been done to her. But she had too much inner strength and spiritual integrity to let that dictate her future. Instead, she made a conscious decision to continue living with unwavering courage. I waited for her in our cozy home when she returned to Wisconsin. The woman in front of me walked through her own personal valley of death and came out on the other side resilient and triumphant. I've known guys who have experienced similar abuse, shootings, shelling, or explosions. They always had a haunting look. Eve didn't have that. She's been through much worse. But she looked calm, peaceful, and radiated beauty. Her level of bravery deserved a medal. She closed the door and leaned against it. She looked around, as if enjoying a safe haven after a particularly violent storm. I just stood there while she got her emotions in order. Then she rushed towards me, and hugged me tightly, as if she never wanted to let go. I looked down at her tear-stained face, and we kissed for the first time since we went through all this suffering. I said, "Welcome home, my love." She responded, "Oh my God, Jonathan, I never thought I would see you again." Of course, she read my mind. She said from the area of my chest, "Has the fact that you killed those people changed you?" I laughed and said, "They weren't human. These were rabid animals. Knowing what they probably did to you, I loved every second of it. She said with wisdom in every syllable, I feel the same. As far as I am concerned, our love remains pure and untouched. Whatever they did to my body, they did not touch me. I was protected within myself by my love for you and our life together. Every second of this terrible time, I hid behind the impenetrable walls of this commitment. I would never allow these vile creatures to stain the soul I gave to you. I looked into her incredible icy blue eyes. They looked at me with deep longing. I actually asked out loud, "Are you sure about this?" She said with a loving irony in her voice. "I have never been more confident in my life. I need to burn this experience out of me, and you are the only person who can do it. So let's get to therapy." She wasn't kidding. We made love. Then she opened one eye and looked at me. It was like a Caerleon lake, deep and bottomless. She said with deep emotion in her voice, "Thank you, my dear. Our love was the only reason I survived this hell." We made love all weekend. I told Eva that I was ready to talk about anything she wanted, but she said there was nothing to talk about. As far as she was concerned, this whole terrible thing happened in a distant and forgotten universe. She was where she belonged, where she always wanted to be, and that was all she cared about. Doris came with the usual Sunday feast, and we spent the whole Sunday surrounded by an atmosphere of family contentment. When we went to bed, I said, "Your mother told me about your problems with Williams." She looked gloomy and said, "I'll deal with this tomorrow morning. He never really touched me. But if I succeed, this smug sack of shit will never practice medicine again." I said softly, "You should have told me." She looked genuinely surprised and said, "So what? So that you kill him. I love you too much to lock you up for life. And I knew that's exactly what would happen if I told you." She was right. It wouldn't be a pretty sight. Then she got serious and said, "When he gave us this trip, I was gathering evidence to file a sexual harassment complaint. I knew he just wanted to be alone with me so he could work on me. The smug bastard really thinks every woman he meets wants to sleep with him." She laughed mockingly and added, "As if that would ever happen. He didn't even realize that my phone was recording his sentences all the time." Wow, I would send a letter of thanks to the guys who systematically and brutally beat this bastard. But unfortunately, they were all dead. Then she smiled slyly and said, "The fact that I was in danger because of his machinations is just the tip of the whole bullshit mountain. I'm not just going to file a complaint. I'm also going to sue the Mayo Clinic for negligence for allowing a womanizer like him to supervise any woman. When I'm done, our lives will be the same as before he came." I made a mental note to never contact my loving wife. She was a little more ferocious than Mother Bear, at least when it came to the people she loved. In fact, she looked a lot like her mother, Doris. I turned off the light, and we lay down under the blanket, huddled close to each other, just the two of us. The Mayo Clinic was so eager to resolve Eve's complaint that they sent a team of top lawyers to negotiate. They knew how they were set up. Obviously, the doctor had previous similar incidents in Rochester, which is why he was sent to the wilds of Wisconsin. The fact that Eve had recorded evidence of sexual harassment at the clinic was bad, but she also had evidence that she had been attacked and possibly killed due to the doctor's machinations. This made them desperate to hush everything up, so they offered millions. We refused. All we wanted was our simple life back. Therefore, we have agreed to their ironclad commitment to guarantee our professional independence within the minimum requirements of the law. Then we went back to primary care practice. Naturally, the American Medical Association was not happy with the doctor. It takes a lot to revoke a license, but they did everything they could. They also made it clear that any further mistakes would ensure that he would practice medicine in some place like Uruguay because he would not be licensed in the U.S. Of course, the Mayo Clinic fired him. They also did their best to spread awareness of his problems to the medical community. Last anyone heard, he was working at a clinic in Nome, Alaska. 7 months have passed. Every day was filled with love and satisfying work. Then in January, in her 39th year, Eva announced that she was pregnant. She was delighted. I reminded her of what the doctors said. She said that during gynecological examinations, doctors in Bethesda diagnosed her condition and corrected it with microsurgical stitches. Eva told me their main concern was that the renovations would prevent her from getting pregnant. But since she already was pregnant, it was a moot point. We could expect a joyful event in 6 months. Eva wanted a child so badly that she spent the last 2 months in bed. The entire city had been watching the events of recent weeks more closely than the events at Lambeau Field, which should give you an idea of how important the birth was for all these good-hearted people. Doris was omnipresent, feeding, instructing, and fluffing Eva's pillows. We were close enough to our natural due date that the doctors in Madison decided to induce labor. The night before, a motorcade of cars escorted us along US-90 to the University of Wisconsin Hospital. The whole city wanted to be there when the happy event happened. I was with Eva throughout the birth. She may be 39 years old, but she had the strength and energy of a much younger woman. Little Brooklyn was born at 2:19 p.m. on a beautiful October day. The sun outside literally illuminated the maternity ward with a golden light. It seemed that only the sky trumpets were missing. Brookie loudly protested her treatment as she was placed on the table to be cleaned, so I went over to talk to her. I said, "I'd like to introduce myself, my little darling. I am your dad, and your happiness will be my goal for the rest of my life." My little princess stopped crying and focused her bright blue eyes on me. It was a strikingly normal look for someone who had only been in this world for 5 minutes. She then reached for the finger I held out to her. She grabbed it with her small hand, held it, and quietly looked at me. She may have recognized my voice from all the times I spoke to her in the womb, or it may have just been a reflex. However, this simple act has strengthened the bond between me, my wife, and my child that only a husband and father can understand. I knew then and there that it was all worth it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.